It started on a sun-drenched afternoon. I wasn't looking for temptation, but there it was, right outside my window. Ron. I don't know what made me stop and watch. Maybe it was the rhythmic way he worked, the way his muscles flexed under his sweat-dampened t-shirt, the easy strength in his arms as he pushed the wheelbarrow. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, and I felt something shift inside me. An awareness. A heat. And from that moment, I couldn't stop watching him. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I wasn't supposed to feel this way. I was married. Happy. Even. But Ron's image burned in my mind. The way his shirt clung to his body, the way his hands gripped the garden tools. I turned over, pressing my thighs together, swallowing hard. My husband lay beside me, oblivious. I tried to push Ron out of my head. Tried. And failed. The next day, I found myself outside, a little too often. I asked Ron if he needed anything. A glass of water, maybe? He smiled, thanked me, and I felt that smile coil low in my stomach. I started lingering near him, asking about his work, about plants I suddenly pretended to care about. It was innocent. At least, that's what I told myself. But then, I invited him in for coffee. And when he stepped into my kitchen, filling the space with his presence, my breath hitched. He sat at my kitchen table, his hands wrapped around the mug. I leaned against the counter, trying not to stare at the way his forearms flexed when he lifted the cup. "So, how did you get into gardening?" I asked, my voice too casual. He chuckled. "Didn't plan it. Just always liked working with my hands." I swallowed hard. Images flashed through my mind, his hands on my skin, his weight pressing me into the counter. I needed to stop. But I didn't want to. Every moment with Ron made the hunger inside me worse. I started dressing differently when I knew he'd be around. Nothing obvious. Just enough to make me feel seen. I wondered if he noticed. If he could sense the way my body leaned toward his. The way my breath quickened when he came too close. Did he feel it too? Or was this only my private torment? I told myself I was being ridiculous. That I was overthinking it. And yet, every time I stepped outside, I knew exactly when he would be there. I found myself wearing soft summer dresses, the kind that clung just a little in the heat. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing anyone would call flirting. But when I bent down to check a flower, I was acutely aware of his gaze flickering toward me. And when he spoke, deep, steady, masculine, I swore I heard something in his voice. Something unspoken. Something dangerous. One afternoon, I stepped outside just as he was packing up for the day. "Ron," I called, before I could stop myself. He turned, his shirt damp with sweat, slung over one shoulder. His chest, bare beneath the heat of the sun, all muscle and strength. I swallowed. Hard. "Thanks for the work today." He smiled. "No problem. It's coming along nicely." I was the one who stepped closer. I was the one who stood just a little too near. And he didn't move away. For a moment, I thought, hoped, he would touch me. That his fingers would brush my arm, my waist, anywhere. Instead, he simply nodded. "See you tomorrow, Clara." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, my husband beside me, his back turned. The only sound was the faint hum of the ceiling fan. I closed my eyes. I saw Ron. Not in the garden, but in my kitchen. His hands gripping the counter, his lips parting. I let out a sharp breath, turning onto my side. It was dangerous, this feeling. It was wrong. And yet, I burned for it. The next morning, I decided to go for a walk in the garden. Innocently. Ron was there, tending to the hedges. I smiled. "Morning. Morning, Clara." His voice was warm. I liked the way he said my name. I moved toward the table where I'd left my iced tea, reaching for the glass at the same time he stepped toward the hedge trimmer beside it. Our hands brushed. It was nothing. And everything. A jolt of heat shot through me. My breath hitched. He stilled. So did I. I should have pulled away. I should have laughed it off. But for a fraction of a second, neither of us moved. Then, he cleared his throat and stepped back. "Sorry," he murmured. But I saw it, the flicker in his gaze. He felt it too. I told myself I imagined it. But the next time I caught him looking at me, really looking, I knew. And that was when I stopped pretending. I stopped pretending that I wasn't dressing for him. That I wasn't lingering outside just a little too long. That I wasn't desperate for him to do something. And I knew it was only a matter of time before one of us finally would. The sky had been threatening a storm all afternoon. Heavy clouds loomed as Ron worked, his movements sure, deliberate. I watched from the kitchen window, my pulse thrumming. Then, the heavens split open. Thunder growled in the distance as rain poured down in thick, silver sheets. Ron straightened, glancing up, his soaked t-shirt clinging to every hard ridge of his chest. Something inside me snapped. I grabbed an umbrella and rushed outside, pretending, lying to myself, that this was just about keeping him dry. "Come in before you catch cold," I called. He hesitated. Then, he followed me inside. The air between us changed the moment I closed the door. He stood there, dripping, his white t-shirt almost transparent, his chest rising and falling. I swallowed hard. "I'll get you a towel." He said nothing. I turned, but before I could take a step, I felt him behind me, close enough that my skin tingled, my breath caught. Clara. Just my name. But it wasn't just my name. Slowly, I turned back to face him. His eyes were darker than I'd ever seen them. Something in me screamed to stop this. But another part, the part that had been longing, aching, starving, didn't care anymore. I should have moved away. Instead, I reached up. My fingers brushed his jaw, rough, warm, real. His breath shuddered. "Tell me to stop," he said hoarsely. I didn't. Instead, I whispered, "Don't." His restraint broke. The towel fell to the floor, forgotten. His hands were on me, gripping my waist, pulling me flush against him. The warmth of his body seeped into mine. The storm outside nothing compared to the storm inside me. His lips hovered over mine. A pause, a hesitation, a final chance to stop. I didn't take it. And then, we shattered. The storm had passed, but inside me, a hurricane remained. Ron had left. The kitchen was exactly as it had been before, except for the towel on the floor and the ghost of his touch on my skin. I pressed my palms to the counter, my breath still uneven. The air was thick, suffocating. What had I done? That night, I lay beside my husband, staring at the ceiling. He was asleep, his breathing steady, oblivious. I turned away from him, my body still tingling from Ron's touch. It was a cruel irony. I had spent months craving it, imagining it, aching for it. And now, the weight of it crushed me. I had gotten what I wanted. But at what cost? The next morning, I watched from the upstairs window as Ron worked in the garden. I should have gone downstairs, should have faced him. Instead, I stayed hidden. I wanted to pretend it never happened. But I also knew I couldn't. Days passed. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. But every glance, every accidental brush of our hands when I passed him in the garden, was thick with everything we weren't saying. The tension was unbearable. I wanted to speak, to acknowledge, to confess, to understand. But what could I say? What could he? I thought I could live with it. I was wrong. One evening, I found him by the garden shed. I hesitated, then whispered, "Ron." He turned slowly. His eyes, once filled with heat, with desire, now held something else. Regret. "We can't do this again," he said softly. A lump formed in my throat. "I know." Silence. Then, with a small nod, he turned and walked away. And just like that, it was over. Except, it wasn't. Because how do you forget something that had already become part of you? It started as a whisper, a thought in the back of my mind. But soon, it became a pulse, a drumbeat in my chest, demanding action. Leave. Run. Start over. I had the means. My trust fund was untouched. waiting like a golden key to a life I had never dared to claim. I was tired of lying next to a man who never saw me. Tired of pretending that my life, our life, was enough. I wanted more. I wanted Ron. I found Ron by the tool shed. "Come with me," I said, my voice steady but my heart racing. He looked up, his brow furrowed. "What?" "Marbella. Just us. No hiding. No guilt." His jaw tightened. "Clara." I stepped closer, placing my hands on his chest. "We could have a life together. No secrets. No pretending. I have money. We wouldn't have to worry about anything." His breath hitched. He was tempted. I knew it. I felt it. And yet, he hesitated. At the airport, I waited. I had bought 2 tickets. One for me. One for him. The final boarding call echoed through the terminal. And then, he appeared. Breathless, eyes dark with something I couldn't name. I exhaled, my heart hammering as he reached for my hand. No words were needed. We had made our choice. The sun burned gold over the Mediterranean as I leaned back on the balcony, a glass of wine in my hand. Ron stepped behind me, his arms encircling my waist. This was it. Freedom. Passion. A new life. But in the quiet moments, beneath the rush of reckless abandon, a thought lingered. Had I made the right choice? At first, Marbella was everything I imagined. Mornings wrapped in linen sheets, Ron's warmth beside me. Afternoons spent on the sun-drenched terrace of our villa, sipping sangria, my skin bronzed and glowing. Nights tangled in passion, our bodies humming with something raw and reckless. I had traded predictability for adventure, comfort for desire, a life of duty for a life of pleasure. And yet, pleasure never lasts forever. Ron started to change. Or maybe he had always been this way, and I was only now seeing it. He no longer looked at me with that same hunger. His touch grew absent-minded. He spent more time at the beach bars, drinking with locals, his laughter too loud, his temper quick. "You don't need to work," I reminded him. "We have everything we need." But his pride bristled at my money, at the way I controlled things. One night, he came home drunk. Really drunk. "What is this, Clara?" he slurred, throwing his arms up at the villa. "Some fantasy. You think I was going to be your toy forever?" The words sliced through me. I wasn't sure if it was the alcohol talking, or if, deep down, he meant it. The bed felt colder each night. Ron stopped coming home sometimes. When he did, he smelled of perfume that wasn't mine. I told myself this was just a phase, that we had thrown ourselves into a whirlwind, and we simply needed to find our balance. But then came the day I woke up and found a note on the kitchen counter. "I need space. Don't wait up." I sat at the table, my coffee growing cold, staring at those 4 words. Something inside me cracked. One evening, I wandered through Marbella's crowded streets alone. Couples laughed over candlelit dinners. Women in designer dresses clutched their lovers' arms. A guitar played somewhere in the distance. I had thought I was free, but I was trapped in a different kind of cage. Ron had never been my escape. He had just been another illusion. And now, I was truly alone. When Ron finally came home, I was waiting. "I'm leaving," I said simply. He scoffed, running a hand through his sun-bleached hair. "Where would you go?" "Anywhere that isn't here." For the first time in weeks, his eyes softened. Maybe he did care. Maybe I had meant something. But maybe, caring had never been enough. I picked up my suitcase, walked past him, and didn't look back. The plane lifted off, Marbella shrinking beneath me. I didn't know where I was going yet. But for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly where I wasn't meant to be.